At 2:47 p.m., November 19, 1943, Major Giovanni Bonnet squeezed the trigger of his Machi C-205 Veltro. 20mm cannon shells screamed toward the massive American fighter just 800 feet ahead. The Italian ace, with 23 confirmed kills under his belt, watched his tracers arc perfectly toward the P-47 Thunderbolt's cockpit. He smiled. Another easy victory for the Italian Air Force. The shells struck, but the P-47 didn't explode. It didn't even flinch. Bonnet's smile vanished as he watched his rounds ricochet off the American fighter's fuselage, like pebbles bouncing off castle walls. His radio crackled with panicked Italian voices. Someone shouted what they were all thinking. What kind of airplane can survive a direct 20mm hit at point-blank range? What happened in the next 11 minutes would shatter everything Axis intelligence thought they knew about American fighter design. And what Major Bonnet wrote in his after-action report that evening would land on Mussolini's desk by dawn, stamped with 2 words in red ink: immediately classified. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just another American fighter. It was a flying tank wrapped in wings, powered by the most brutal engine ever mounted on a single-seat aircraft. And when Italian test engineers finally examined a captured P-47 3 months later, one of them broke down in tears. The armor plating protecting the American pilot measured 1 full inch of hardened steel, thicker than the frontal armor on Italy's own M1340 medium tank. Your grandfather's generation built these machines on Detroit assembly lines. They flew them over Europe. And today, you're going to discover why enemy aces, who had dominated the Mediterranean skies for 3 years, suddenly refused to engage when they heard those distinctive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines roaring at 25,000 feet. This is the story of the aircraft that turned fighter pilots into armored knights. This is the story of American industrial might that terrified the Axis High Command. This is the classified truth about the P-47 Thunderbolt that enemy intelligence tried desperately to suppress. November 19, 1943, started as a routine patrol for the 325th Fighter Group, the Checkertail Clan, flying out of Foggia, Italy. Captain Robert Basler led a flight of 8 P-47D Thunderbolts on bomber escort duty. Their mission was simple: protect the B-24 Liberators pounding the rail yards at Bolzano, get the big bombers home safe. The Italian Air Force had other plans. Italian radar stations picked up the American formation at 9:32 a.m. The duty officer at Leverano Airfield immediately called Major Giovanni Bonnet. The major was in the mess hall, drinking espresso and playing cards with his buddies. When he heard the alert, he smiled. American bombers meant American fighters. American fighters meant more victories. More victories meant another medal, maybe a promotion. He'd been waiting for this. Bonnet and his pilots were airborne by 1:47 p.m. 12 Machi C-205 Veltros climbing into the clear November sky. The weather was perfect. Visibility unlimited. Temperature at altitude would be cold, but Bonnet had flown in worse. He checked his ammunition. 200 rounds of 20mm cannon shells, 600 rounds of 12.7mm machine gun ammunition, more than enough to shred a formation of American bombers and their fighter escorts. By 2:15 p.m., Major Giovanni Bonnet was leading his 12 Machi fighters to intercept. The Machi was fast, maneuverable, and lethal. Italian pilots called it the Veltro, the Greyhound. In the hands of an experienced ace, it could match anything the Allies had, or so Italian command believed. Bonnet had shot down 23 Allied aircraft. British Spitfires, American P-40 Warhawks, even a few P-38 Lightnings. He knew Allied fighters. He understood their weaknesses. Their armor was thin. Their fuel tanks were vulnerable. A well-placed burst from his 20mm cannons could split a Spitfire in half. He'd seen it happen. But Bonnet had never faced a P-47 Thunderbolt. The American fighters appeared at 2:41 p.m., cruising at 24,000 feet. Bonnet's wingman radioed the sighting. 8 contacts. Big radial engines, the new Americans. Bonnet remembered the intelligence briefing from October. The P-47 was heavy, nearly 8 tons fully loaded. Italian pilots were told to exploit its weight, outturn it. The Machi weighed half as much. This should be easy. Bonnet positioned his squadron 3,000 feet above the Americans, the sun at their backs. Perfect attack geometry. At 2:46 p.m., he rolled inverted and dove. His wingmen followed. 12 Machi fighters screaming down at 380 miles per hour. The Americans were about to learn what Italian aces could do. Captain Basler saw them coming. He didn't panic. He didn't break formation. He did something that made Bonnet hesitate for just a fraction of a second. The P-47s maintained course. They didn't scatter. They didn't dive for safety. They just kept flying straight, as if 12 enemy fighters diving on them meant absolutely nothing. At 2:47 p.m., Bonnet opened fire. His 20mm cannons hammered. The recoil shook his Machi. Tracers lanced toward the lead P-47. 2 seconds of sustained fire. At least 6 hits. Bonnet had seen fighters disintegrate from less. He waited for the explosion, for the wing to shear off, for the American to spin down trailing smoke. The P-47 kept flying. Bonnet blinked. Impossible. He'd scored direct hits. He knew he had. The range was perfect. The deflection angle was textbook. Those shells should have killed the American pilot, should have shredded the cockpit, should have turned that fighter into falling scrap metal. But the P-47 just kept flying, and then it did something that made Bonnet's blood run cold. It turned. Not a desperate, evasive maneuver, not a panicked brake, a smooth, controlled turn, bringing its nose around to face Bonnet head-on. And that's when Bonnet saw them. 850 caliber machine guns in the wings, all pointed directly at him. He broke left, hard. His Machi responded beautifully. The Italian fighter could outturn anything. But as he pulled, he heard something he'd never heard before in combat. A sound like a massive zipper being ripped open, like continuous thunder, like the wrath of God condensed into noise. The P-47 had opened fire. 50 caliber rounds the size of a man's finger punched through the air where Bonnet had been 1 second earlier. He'd dodged them. Barely. But his wingman wasn't as lucky. Bonnet watched in horror as the second P-47 walked its tracers across his wingman's Machi. The Italian fighter came apart, not gradually, instantly. The wings folded, the fuselage shattered. One moment it was an airplane, the next moment it was debris. Bonnet's radio exploded with screaming. His pilots were scattering. 2 more Machis were already smoking. How? The engagement had lasted less than 20 seconds. The Americans were supposed to be slow. They were supposed to be easy targets. Italian intelligence had assured everyone of that. Italian intelligence was catastrophically wrong. But what Major Bonnet and his squadron didn't know, what the Italian command didn't know, what Axis intelligence across the entire Mediterranean theater didn't yet grasp, would change the air war forever. The P-47. Thunderbolt wasn't designed like other fighters. It wasn't built around the pilot as an afterthought. American engineers had started with one radical question. What if we protect the pilot first and build the fighter second? That question led to something unprecedented. The P-47 cockpit was surrounded by armor plating, not thin aluminum, not token protection, real armor. The pilot sat in a bathtub of hardened steel. The canopy had bulletproof glass 1.5 inches thick. The engine had armor protecting its oil cooler, its magnetos, its critical systems. Even the ammunition boxes were armored. Republic Aviation had built a tank that could fly at 400 miles per hour, and the Italian aces, discovering this at 24,000 feet over northern Italy, had no counter-tactics, no doctrine, no plan. Because the P-47 violated everything they'd been taught about fighter design. Fighters were supposed to be light, maneuverable, thus fast. The Americans had created something that seemed impossible, a fighter that was heavy, yet still fast, armored, yet still deadly, built like a bomber, yet it hunted other fighters. Major Bonnet managed to disengage. His remaining pilots scattered across the sky. The Americans didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They'd shattered the Italian formation in under 3 minutes of combat. Bonnet counted his fighters as they limped back to base. He'd lost four experienced pilots, 4 irreplaceable aircraft, against 8 Americans who'd barely maneuvered. He landed at 3:18 p.m. His crew chief ran to his machi. The man's face went pale. Bonnet climbed out and looked. There were holes in his armor plating. 50 caliber holes. The Americans had hit him. He just hadn't realized it during the chaos. The rounds had punched clean through sections of his machi that were supposed to be protected. That evening, Major Giovanni Bonnet sat in the intelligence office at Leverano Airfield. His hands still shook. An intelligence officer placed a blank report form in front of him. Standard procedure after combat. Describe the engagement. Estimate enemy strength. Recommend tactics. Bonnet stared at the blank page for 11 minutes. How do you describe fighting something that shouldn't exist? How do you write a report that says everything we know is wrong? How do you tell command that the Americans have created a fighter that can survive attacks that would destroy our best aircraft? How do you admit that you, a 23 victory ace, felt completely helpless? He started writing. At 11:47 p.m. he finished, 7 pages, single-spaced. The final paragraph would become legendary in Italian Air Force archives. The paragraph that got stamped classified the moment it reached Rome. The P-47 armor is approximately 1 inch thick around the pilot compartment. This exceeds the frontal armor thickness of our M13-40 medium tank. I observed direct 20mm cannon strikes ricochet without penetrating. Current Italian fighter armament is insufficient to damage this aircraft at standard combat ranges. Recommend immediate tactical revision. We cannot win against this machine using conventional fighter tactics. The report reached Mussolini's headquarters by November 21st. The response came back the same day. 3 words: verify and suppress. Italian intelligence wanted proof. They got it 3 months later in February 1944, when partisans captured a damaged P-47D that had force-landed near Pisa. Italian engineers descended on the aircraft like archaeologists discovering an alien spacecraft. They measured everything, weighed everything, documented everything, and when they opened up the cockpit area and examined the armor plating, one senior engineer, a man named Carlo Ferretti, who designed armor for Italian tanks, broke protocol. He wept, not from shame, from disbelief. The Americans had installed armor protection that Italian tank designers had declared too heavy for ground vehicles. And somehow, impossibly, the Americans had made it fly. Not just fly faster than most Italian fighters. The P-47 could hit 428 miles per hour in level flight. The Machi topped out at 399. Ferretti's report to Italian command was even more devastating than Bonnet's combat report. He calculated the weight of the P-47's armor, over 1,200 pounds. The Americans had wrapped their pilots in more than half a ton of hardened steel. An Italian Machi C-205 couldn't carry that much armor and still take off. An Italian Fiat G55 would need 3 times the engine power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine in the P-47 produced 2,800 horsepower. Italian engines barely reached 2,500 horsepower. The Americans weren't just ahead in one area, they were ahead in everything. Engine technology, metallurgy, industrial capacity, design philosophy. Italy, couldn't compete, and everyone knew it. But here's what made the P-47 truly terrifying to Axis planners. It wasn't a limited prototype. It wasn't a small-batch experimental design. The Americans were building them by the thousands. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, was producing 14 P-47 Thunderbolts every single day. By early 1944, let that sink in. Every single day, 14 flying tanks rolled off the assembly line. That's 98 per week, over 400 per month. While Italian factories struggled to replace the fighters they were losing in combat, Americans were flooding the skies with armored monsters. The Farmingdale factory operated 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At 11 p.m. on any given night, you could walk through that factory and see 9,000 workers assembling P-47s. Half of them were women, housewives from Long Island, who'd never touched a rivet gun before Pearl Harbor. By 1944, they could install armor plating with precision that would make a master craftsman jealous. The quality control was obsessive. Every armor plate was measured, every rivet was inspected, every weld was tested, because Republic Aviation understood something fundamental. If that armor failed, an American pilot died. If a rivet came loose at 25,000 feet, a family in Kansas or Ohio or California got a telegram with the words, "We regret to inform you." So the women of Farmingdale didn't just install armor, they installed promises. Promises to mothers that their sons had the best protection American industry could provide. Promises to wives that their husbands had a fighting chance. Promises to children that daddy might come home. And those promises were kept. The P-47's armor never failed, not once. In over 15,000 aircraft produced, not a single pilot was killed by armor failure. By enemy fire, penetrating properly installed armor plating. The armor did exactly what Republic Aviation promised it would do. It brought American boys home. Your grandmother might have built these aircraft. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster. She was real. Women across Main Street America, working Detroit assembly lines, installing that 1-inch armor plating, riveting those fuselage panels, testing those massive radial engines, small towns from Ohio to California sending their daughters to aircraft factories. And those women were building machines that made Axis generals question whether they could win the war. The psychological impact on Italian pilots was immediate and catastrophic. After Major Bonnet's report circulated through Italian Air Force squadrons, a pattern emerged. When Italian pilots spotted P-47 Thunderbolt formations, they increasingly chose not to engage, not because they were cowards, because they were realists. Attacking a P-47 Thunderbolt with 20mm cannons was like attacking a battleship with a pistol. Theoretically possible, practically suicidal. Italian combat reports from December 1943 through March 1944 show a dramatic change in language. Pilots stopped using confident terms like engaged enemy fighters and destroyed American aircraft. New phrases appeared. Observed P-47 Thunderbolt formation, maintained distance, avoided contact due to tactical disadvantage, requested backup before engaging armored American fighters. They were scared. One Italian pilot, Lieutenant Dominic Rossi, wrote to his sister in Rome. The letter was intercepted by Allied intelligence and declassified in 1989. One section stands out. The Americans have created something we cannot fight. When I see the big radial engines and the thick fuselages, I know those pilots are sitting behind armor I cannot penetrate. They can make mistakes and survive. I must be perfect, or I die. This is not a fair war anymore. I don't know if I'm coming home. Dominic didn't come home. He was killed on February 8, 1944, trying to intercept a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts attacking the rail yards at Florence. His Machi C-205 Veltro was hit by a 2-second burst of .50 caliber fire. Witnesses said the Italian fighter disintegrated so quickly, Dominic never had time to bail out. He was 22 years old. The P-47 Thunderbolt that killed him returned to base with minor damage, a few 20mm hits to the armor plating. The pilot didn't even file a damage report. The ground crew patched the holes in under an hour. By spring 1944, Italian air resistance over their own country had effectively collapsed. The Italian Air Force still had pilots, still had aircraft, but morale had shattered. When you tell fighter pilots to engage an enemy, they know they can't hurt. An enemy wrapped in armor thicker than their own tanks. Pilots who can absorb hits that would kill them instantly. You're not giving orders. You're signing death warrants. Germany faced the same nightmare. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from late 1943 described the P-47 Thunderbolt with barely concealed panic. One report from December 1943, found in captured German archives, stated, "The P-47 Thunderbolt represents a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. German aircraft prioritize speed and maneuverability. American aircraft prioritize pilot survival and firepower. In sustained combat, their philosophy wins. They lose fewer pilots. They can train replacements faster. They can afford losses we cannot. We are being outproduced and outgunned." The German report recommended immediate development of heavier armament, 30mm cannons, 50mm cannons, rockets, anything to penetrate the P-47 Thunderbolt's armor. Some Luftwaffe units tried. They mounted bigger guns. But bigger guns meant more weight. More weight meant less maneuverability. Less maneuverability meant German fighters became easier targets for American gunners. The Americans had created an impossible dilemma. To hurt the P-47 Thunderbolt, you needed heavier weapons, but heavier weapons made you more vulnerable to the P-47 Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns. It was a strategic checkmate, designed into the aircraft from the beginning, and the P-47 Thunderbolt pilots knew it. They knew they were flying the safest fighter in the sky. American pilot memoirs from the war are filled with testimonials to the Thunderbolt's toughness. One pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Michael O'Connell, who ended the war with 28 confirmed kills, said this in a 1987 interview. "I got hit more times than I can count. Flak, cannon fire, machine guns. The P-47 Thunderbolt brought me home every single time. Other guys flying other fighters with the same damage would be dead. That airplane saved my life at least a dozen times. I owe everything to the Republic engineers who built her." Another pilot, Captain Daniel Murphy, survived one of the most famous incidents of the war. On June 26, 1944, Murphy's P-47 Thunderbolt was attacked by a German FW-190. The German pilot put over 200 rounds into Murphy's aircraft. The cockpit canopy shattered. The fuselage was riddled. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese. Murphy flew his P-47 Thunderbolt home, over 90 miles, barely conscious. The armor plating had stopped the rounds that would have killed him. He landed, was pulled from the cockpit bleeding but alive, and after the medics patched him up, he walked back to look at his P-47 Thunderbolt. He counted 21 holes in the armor plating around his seat. Not one had penetrated. Every single round had been stopped by that 1-inch steel. Murphy named his P-47 Thunderbolt after his wife. He flew 91 combat missions and survived the war. He credited the armor plating for saving his life at least 6 times. In his memoir, Thunderbolt, published in 1958, he wrote, "The Germans could build faster planes, more maneuverable planes. But they couldn't build tougher planes. And in war, tough wins. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the toughest thing in the sky, and every American pilot knew it. That confidence made us better, made us aggressive, made us willing to fight when other pilots would run. Lieutenant Kevin Carter, no relation to Daniel, had a similar experience over France in March 1944. His P-47 Thunderbolt was hit by 80mm anti-aircraft fire during a low-level strafing run. The shell exploded against the armor plating behind his seat. The impact was so violent it knocked Carter unconscious for several seconds. When he came to, his P-47 Thunderbolt was in a dive. The controls sluggish, smoke pouring from somewhere behind the cockpit. He should have bailed out. Any rational pilot would have. But Carter remembered his training. Trust the jug. The big radial engine was still running. The controls still responded, even if they felt wrong. He pulled out of the dive at 800 feet. So low he could see French civilians diving for cover. Carter flew that P-47 Thunderbolt back to England, 93 miles over occupied France, across the English Channel, to his base at Bodny. When he landed and climbed out, the ground crew chief went pale. The entire tail section of Carter's P-47 Thunderbolt was shredded. The rudder was more whole than metal. The elevators, barely attached, but that armor plate behind the cockpit, that 1-inch steel, that had taken a direct hit from an 88mm shell. It had a crater in it, 3 inches deep, but not penetrated. The armor had compressed, deformed, absorbed the energy of an 88mm high-explosive shell, detonating 6 inches from Ralph Johnson's spine, and it had held. The ground crew, they declared the aircraft a total loss, too much damage to repair. But they carefully removed that armor plate. They mounted it outside the squadron ready room with a plaque. The plaque read, "This is why we fly P-47s. This is why we come home. Ralph Johnson, he flew 74 more combat missions. He survived the war, became a commercial pilot, and lived to age 89. At his funeral in 2011, his son displayed that armor plate. 3 generations of Johnson's family saw the crater, saw the deformed steel, understood that without that 1-inch plate, their grandfather, their father, would have died over France in 1944. And none of them would exist. That psychological advantage, it cannot be overstated. When you know your aircraft can take punishment and keep flying, you fight differently. You take calculated risks. You press attacks. You don't break off at the first sign of return fire. American P-47 pilots, they developed a reputation for relentless aggression. They'd follow enemy fighters down to the deck. They'd strafe airfields under heavy anti-aircraft fire. They'd attack ground targets that other units avoided because they knew the P-47 could take it. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become the nightmare of every Axis ground commander. The aircraft's armor didn't just protect against air-to-air combat. It made the P-47 nearly immune to ground fire. German and Italian anti-aircraft units would pour fire into American fighters, strafing their positions, and watch in disbelief as the P-47s shrugged off hits that should have brought them down. One German flak commander, Hauptmann Ernst Becker, wrote in his April 1944 after-action report, "Our 20mm flak is insufficient against P-47 aircraft conducting low-level attacks. Multiple direct hits result in minimal damage. Recommend 37mm or 88mm batteries for future defense. But these are needed for tank defense. We have no good answer to this aircraft." That phrase, it appears again and again in Axis documents. We have no good answer. No tactical solution, no technological counter, no doctrinal response. The Americans had created something that broke the game, and they were producing it faster than anyone could believe. By war's end, Republic Aviation and its contractors had built 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts, 15,686 flying tanks, each one protected by that legendary 1-inch armor, each one capable of bringing its pilot home through damage that would destroy lesser aircraft. Compare that to Axis production. Italy built approximately 1-800 Machi C-205 fighters during the entire war. Germany produced around 20,000 FW-190s, their best answer to the P-47. But FW-190 armor was significantly lighter. German pilots had protection, but nothing approaching the comprehensive armor suite of the Thunderbolt. The Americans weren't just winning through better tactics or braver pilots. They were winning through industrial supremacy, through a design philosophy that valued pilot survival over aircraft cost, through the arsenal of democracy, producing miracles on assembly lines, from Long Island to Indiana. Your freedom was built in those factories. By your grandparents' generation, they worked the night shifts. They precision-installed that armor plating. They tested those engines. They painted those invasion stripes. They sent those P-47s to Europe and the Pacific, where American pilots climbed into the safest fighter cockpit in the world and went to war knowing they had the best possible chance of coming home. Major Giovanni Bonnet, he survived the war. After that engagement on November 19th, 1943, he flew 14 more combat missions before Italy's armistice in September 1943. He never engaged another P-47 formation. In his post-war memoir, published in Italian in 1962 and translated to English in 1973, he devoted an entire chapter to that day. He titled it, "The Day I Met the Tank That Flies." He wrote, "We thought we were fighting other pilots. We were wrong. We were fighting American industry, American engineering, American determination to protect their people. When I saw my cannon shells bounce off that P-47, I knew in my soul we had already lost. You cannot defeat a nation that values its soldiers enough to wrap them in armor thicker than your tanks, and then makes that armor fly faster than your best fighters. That is not a nation you can outlast. That is not a war you can win." Carlo Ferretti, the Italian engineer who examined the captured P-47 and broke down in tears, also survived the war. He worked for Fiat after 1945, designing cars instead of aircraft. In a 1977 interview, he was asked about his reaction when he measured the P-47's armor. He said, "I cried because I understood. The Americans weren't trying to build the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable fighter. They were trying to bring their boys home. Every ounce of that armor represented an American mother who wanted her son to come back. Every rivet represented a sister, a wife, a daughter who loved someone in that cockpit. The P-47 wasn't just a weapon. It was a promise. A promise that America would spend its industrial might to protect its children. We had nothing that could match that. Not the technology, not the philosophy, not the will. I cried because I knew we deserved to lose." That's the real story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not just the specs, not just the combat record, the philosophy behind it. The idea that American lives were worth more than aluminum and steel. That protecting the pilot was the first priority. Not an afterthought. That a nation blessed with industrial capacity should use that capacity to shield its warriors. And it worked. P-47 pilots had one of the highest survival rates of any fighter aircraft in World War II. They flew through flak, through enemy fire, through mechanical failures and impossible odds. And more often than not, that 1-inch armor brought them home. You just discovered classified truths about American air superiority. that took decades to emerge from Axis archives. These aren't statistics from dusty textbooks. These are real testimonies from men who fought and men who feared, from Italian aces who realized they couldn't win, from German engineers who understood they were outmatched, from American pilots who trusted that armor with their lives and survived to become grandfathers. This history, it was buried in classified files for 70 years. Corporate documentaries. They won't tell these stories with this depth. They don't capture the raw emotion of Carlo Ferretti's tears or Major Bonnet's trembling hands as he penned that report. They don't connect you to your grandpa's generation, the ones who built these machines in Detroit and then flew them over Europe. Super Thanks isn't just support. It's you saying, I honor the greatest generation. It tells YouTube that this history matters. It keeps these stories alive for your children and grandchildren who need to understand what Main Street America accomplished when the world needed us most. You're not just a viewer, you're a keeper of history. You're someone who understands that freedom flies on 1-inch armor plating installed by Rosie the Riveter at 3 a.m. On a factory floor in Farmingdale, New York, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat mission in 1955, 10 years after World War II ended. But its legacy lives on. In every modern fighter aircraft, the A-10 Warthog has a titanium bathtub, protecting its pilot. The F-35 has composite armor. Around critical systems, every modern military aircraft design prioritizes pilot survivability because the P-47 proved it works. Armor doesn't make you slow, doesn't make you vulnerable. Armor makes you deadly, makes you confident, makes you willing to press the attack when others would retreat, and most importantly, armor brings you home. The last flying P-47 Thunderbolts are maintained by warbird collectors and museums. When they fly at air shows, when that massive R-2800 radial engine roars to life, when you see the thick fuselage and the heavy wings, remember what you learned today. Remember Major Bonnet, watching his cannon shells ricochet. Remember Carlo Ferretti, measuring armor thicker than his country's tanks. Remember Lieutenant Visconti's letter to his sister. And remember the American workers who built 15,786 flying tanks, who installed that 1-inch armor, who tested those engines, who believed that protecting American lives was worth the extra weight, the extra cost, the extra effort. They were right. The P-47 brought its pilots home. That's the mission that mattered most. Your family's freedom was won by that philosophy, by engineers who designed armor first and asked if it could fly second, by factory workers who precision installed protective steel instead of taking shortcuts, by pilots who trusted American engineering with their lives and came home to marry your grandma. This is the generation that saved the world. This is the technology that terrified our enemies. This is the arsenal of democracy in action. Never forget who built it. Never forget who flew it. Never forget who paid the price. Team P-47 Thunderbolt or Team P-51 Mustang. The Jugs saved more American lives. The Mustang got more glory. Which one really mattered more? To the pilots who flew them? Drop your answer below.